In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, I'm going to be giving you some helpful beginner tips for the class of your choice, and these are going to be helpful things when playing your character in and outside of combat. This is not a how to choose your class video. We've already done a ton of those on how to select your class. This is more like you've already decided to play a class. Now, what are some things that can help you get off to a good start with that class? So first up is Barbarian. Assuming you decided to play a Barbarian, I want to take a look at unarmored defense here. This is you gain at level 1 as a Barbarian, and essentially what it does is it increases your armor class by your Constitution modifier as long as you're not wearing armor. So if you're playing unarmored, you're going to gain extra armor from your Constitution, and you're going to gain extra armor from your Dexterity. So generally speaking, when you play Barbarian, you're going to play a strength-based Barbarian, mostly because you'll probably be using the throwing mechanic in this game, and that is based off your strength. But if for some reason you're using Dexterity, then please disregard this. But if you're playing a Strength Barbarian, you're going to be dumping a lot of points into Strength, and you're going to be dumping a lot of points into Constitution. And because Dexterity adds to your armor class, and you're going to be unarmored, or you're going to try and be unarmored if you're using unarmored defense, you're going to need a lot of points in Dexterity in order to get your armor class up. This means that, best case, you'll probably have 16 Dexterity and 16 Constitution, which means that you would gain 6 to your armor class on top of your default 10. So you'd have 16 armor class when you're unarmored, and that's if you kind of sacrifice strength to get as much Dexterity and Constitution as you can. But if you play with Githyanki Halfplate, for instance, on your Barbarian, you're going to have 15 armor from that, plus 2 from your Dexterity. That's 17 armor already, and you didn't really have to kind of gimp your strength in order to do that. So I think there's a good case to play as a armored Barbarian early on and kind of disregard unarmored defense early on in the game. And another tip I want to give you is about Rage. You only have a couple of charges of Rage early on in the game, so you might be tempted to save them from, for the combats where you really need them. The reality is when you're playing Baldur's Gate 3, you typically long rest after about every 1 or 2 combat encounters, depending on how hard they are, particularly if you're playing on balanced or higher. So you can use them basically every encounter, and you're going to long rest before you run out generally anyway. And then when you get to level 3 and you're choosing a subclass, I recommend taking Berserker if you're a brand new player. It's just so straightforward. It's easy to use. It'll just make you really strong. And I recommend that for a new player. But if you want something a little more interesting than just straight up Berserker, I think Wildheart is a great choice here. And that's because it can add a lot of different variety to the things you can do to combat. Take something like Wolfheart, which makes it so that when you're standing next to enemies, other melee attacks from your friendly characters that are close to those enemies, they have advantage on those rolls. That's really huge, particularly if you have a melee rogue that uses sneak attack and melee range. That means they can get advantage on every attack as long as that Barbarian is next to a character. So there are a lot of ways this can help benefit other melee characters on your team. And it's a little bit more dynamic than I think Berserker is. So I would recommend one of those 2 subclasses. And another thing that I'll say is that if you're playing a Barbarian, you should probably be using a 2-handed weapon. I think most cases it makes the most benefit to use a 2-handed weapon with a Barbarian. You can certainly play dual wield if you want, but I would highly recommend playing 2-handed. And one of the things you might want to consider doing at level 4 is picking up the Great Weapon Master feat, which allows you to have a penalty to your attack roll in exchange for a lot more damage and an extra attack as a bonus action if you kill an enemy or critically hit with that attack. If you're playing Berserker, this is much less relevant because you'll gain an extra attack as a bonus action anyway while you're raging. But if you're playing Wildheart, then this becomes more relevant. And because Reckless Attack gives you advantage on your attack rolls, that -5 penalty becomes a lot less important because advantage gives you a huge increase to your hit chance effectively because you're going to roll twice. So consider taking that at level 4 if you're not Berserker. If you're playing Wildheart, still a good pickup. You can still take it on Berserker for the extra damage if you want as well. And lastly, Barbarians gain an extra attack at level 5 as long as they use their attack action in a turn, so that's going to increase the damage output they have, particularly if they're using Reckless Attack, as that's going to give them advantage on their attack rolls. And they also gain increased movement if they're not wearing heavy armor, so that's going to help with their mobility. So I would suggest not multi-classing a Barbarian before you hit level 5. Okay, moving along to Bard. First thing about Bard is they have a unique cantrip called Vicious Mockery, which you can deal a little bit of damage to a target, but gives it disadvantage on its next attack roll. And this is really, really effective at preventing, a really hard-hitting enemy from throttling your melee unit or whatever they're close to, because it's going to make it more likely they're going to miss, which will prevent damage. You can use this every turn, kind of locking down a very difficult enemy because it's a cantrip, and you might want to consider that. And also, the lines that are spoken when you use Vicious Mockery are just amazing. So make sure you use Vicious Mockery when you need to. Don't use it when you don't, but you will need it sometimes. And make sure when you're preparing spells that you minimally prepare Healing Word. Healing Word is the best early game heal spell spell because it's a bonus action and you can use it at range and it can pick up fallen targets. So throw that thing at range. If somebody goes down, it'll pick them up. You won't have to spend the action of walking over to them and then using the help action to end your turn and then they get up. You can use a bonus action to do it from range, and then you can still use your action to do something else on your turn. So make sure you have Healing Word. Speak with animals is also not bad if you want to talk to animals in the game and you don't have another character that you can, do that on. And choice of subclass, I think I would recommend, really comes down to like what your need is for your group. If you need more of a spellcaster, College of Lore is the way to go. If you need more martial capabilities in combat, you're definitely going to want to take College of Valor or College of Swords. So I think that really depends on your party composition and like what you're kind of lacking in your group. And another thing that I would suggest, if you're playing a bard and you're like a newish player, I would recommend not multi-classing a bard until like after level 6. And this is because College of Lore gains magical secrets at level 6, which is really strong, allowing them to pick 2 spells from another class. So you get like Fireball or something like that. And on College of Valor and College of Swords, you gain extra attack. So that's really, really strong. That's going to give them an extra attack every round. So I recommend to new players, don't multi-class this class until after level 6, regardless of the subclass. So moving along to Cleric, I personally really like for new players either Life Domain to further boost your healing, and also giving you heavy armor proficiency, or I like Light Domain if you want to be more of an offensive spellcaster. This will get you more involved in combat. I think one of the things that clerics can kind of have an issue with early on, particularly if you're not familiar with the class, is being very effective in combat. Light can help you do that as you get a little bit higher level and get some more potent spells. And then if you want to have a more martial-focused cleric, I would suggest Tempest or War. And I like War a bit better than Tempest simply because you can use your bonus action to do another attack a certain number of times before you need to rest. It's usually about 3. It's your wisdom modifier. So if you had 16 wisdom, it would be 3 times before you need a long rest. And that gets you more involved in combat. And, that means at the beginning of the game, you're going to have like 2 attacks a couple of rounds where your fighter will only have 1. And it actually really gets you involved. And again, because you tend to rest after like 1 combat or 2 combats in BG3, particularly in harder difficulties, you'll get this back a lot faster than you think. And it'll just keep you more involved in the martial side of things when you run out of spell slots or when you don't need to cast a support spell. And spells you really want to take on your cleric, Healing Word is another good one. You definitely want to have Guidance. Guidance can be used like pretty much constantly in this game, and it'll affect outside of combat dialogue checks, and it'll affect like, disarming traps and picking locks. With that character, you can actually use it as the roll is going on. That really helps tremendously. Also, Enhance ability is really good. Also on Bard, you should get an ability. I forgot to mention this in Bard. Enhance ability is really good. I like to run Enhance ability on my highest perception character, so I'll throw it on them and it just stays on them until I concentrate on something else. So when they're running around on the landscape, if they have like the owl version of it, they'll actually have advantage on their perception checks, making them more likely to spot hidden things. So that's one little tip there. Make sure you absolutely get Enhanced ability on your Cleric and Guidance. Both of these are very, very strong. I also want to mention Guiding Bolt on Cleric, particularly if you're not playing a martial-focused Cleric. This thing can absolutely hit like a truck. You can use it with level 1 or level 2, level 3 spell slots, so it gets stronger the higher spell slot you cast it with. This thing is an absolute monster early game, and if you want to shell out a lot of damage with your Cleric, Guiding Bolt is the way to go. So talking a bit about Druids, Druids have some similarities to Clerics in terms of some of the spells they can gain. Not all of them are the same, but one I highly recommend picking up on your Druid if you're playing a Druid is Healing Word. I've recommended this on all the support classes. It's really, really strong in this game. Being able to pick friendly unit up from the ground with a bonus action from across the screen is invaluable, so make sure you get this one as soon as you can. Speak to Animals is also really good if you don't have anyone else in your group talking to animals. It seems like a Druid would naturally be able to do that, so taking that is good. That gets you a lot of interactions outside of combat that you will really enjoy in the game, so make sure you have this on at least one character, and if you have a Druid, it should probably be that character. Goodberry is also a very effective heal here, and I highly recommend that if you're looking to get a little more healing on your Druid. I also highly recommend getting Guidance on your Druid if you're playing a Druid, and that'll help outside of combat with dialogue checks. It'll help with trap checks and disarming traps and picking locks and, perception checks and all that stuff, so Guidance is really good on your Druid as well. And if I had to recommend a subclass, I think it's going to come down to Circle of the Land or Circle of the Moon, and that's really going to depend on, do you plan on wild shaping during combat or not? If you're planning on wild shaping a lot during combat, then Circle of the Moon is the way to go. But if you're just trying to figure out what do I do with Druid, Circle of the Land is a good default selection. It's definitely one that's, going to be more towards the spellcasting side than shifting into combat and stuff like that. And I think it's probably a little bit less complicated for a new player since it's just going to play like a spellcaster generally. Other good spells to pick up on your Druid, Enhance ability for the same reason I mentioned on Cleric. This is really, really strong. Make sure you have this. Moonbeam is really good too. I really, really like Moonbeam. This is a spell that does a small AoE, and then you can kind of move it without recasting the spell. And when an enemy starts their turn inside the spell, they take damage. So you damage them initially, and then when they start their turn, they take damage. Really, really strong, especially since you can move this without using extra spell slots early on in the game when you don't have a ton of spell slots. Okay, moving along to Fighter. Fighters gain a class feature at level 2 called Action Surge, which allows them to take a second action in combat, which they typically use for an attack. This can only be used once per every short rest. Highly advised short resting between combat encounters, because again, you typically long rest every 1 or 2 encounters anyway, so you definitely probably won't make it 3 encounters before long resting, so you might as well short rest if you're not long resting between encounters to regain Action Surge. And Action Surge is extremely strong once the fighter hits level 5 because they have extra attack at level 5 if they take their attack action on a turn. So if they attack with their action, they get an extra attack, so they get 2 attacks. And then if you use Action Surge, they can take that attack again, and then they get an extra attack for that second attack. So at level 5, they will essentially gain 4 attacks when they use Action Surge, which is another reason you should definitely short rest before combats or in between combats in order to have Action Surge ready, particularly after level 5. When it comes to your fighting style, I like 5 of the 6 of the fighting styles. I don't really like protection that much. It's a little bit harder to pull off earlier on in the game. And remember that if you choose dueling, this also applies if you're using a shield. So that extra damage you gain will also apply if you're one-handing and using a shield. And when it comes to your fighter subclass, I highly recommend Battle Master for new players. It gives you a lot more dynamic things you can do in combat. Fighters typically early on in the game are move and attack, or attack and don't even move, depending on what's going on. This can give you some like other things you can do in combat besides just attacking. These will modify your attacks in some way. Some of them are like support buffs and things like that. Champion just has passive effects that really aren't going to let you do anything other than move and attack. And Eldritch Knight, even though it's really cool and more dynamic than either of the other two, can be kind of complicated to play early on for a brand new player. So unless you're a little bit more confident, highly recommend going Battle Master. And lastly, because fighters gain extra attack at level 5, you probably don't want to multi-class your fighter until after level 5 because you want to get that extra attack as quickly as possible. There are probably exceptions to this, but if you're a new player, highly recommend getting to level 5 first. So moving along to monks. Monks also have unarmored defense, just like barbarians, but instead of constitution being added to their armor, they have wisdom, so they're going to want some wisdom and dexterity. But because monks are primarily dexterity-focused class, they're going to have a higher armor class probably than a barbarian will be because of all the extra dexterity that they have. So they can play unarmored a lot better. And in fact, I definitely recommend you play your monk unarmored. And then when you're talking about choosing a subclass, I highly recommend Way of the Open Hand is good early on because this, I think, is going to get you the most overall damage early on in the game. And although Way of the 4 Elements is really cool and they have some spells they can use, typically what ends up happening is that you can't get into melee range to use your bonus unarmed attack, which is one of the benefits of a monk. So it's kind of difficult to play a ranged monk with some of these spells. You could pick more close range ones, which I highly recommend if you're playing that subclass. I feel like Way of the Open Hand is good early on, and then Way of Shadow is better later. Once you get Shadow Step at level 6, it becomes a lot stronger, but you don't get that until level 6. So if you want to play Way of Shadow, I highly recommend going Way of the Open Hand early and then just respecking into Way of Shadow later. And monks gain an extra attack at level 5, just like barbarians and fighters do, so you probably don't want to multi-class your monk until after level 5, because that extra attack can be huge for them. Okay, moving along to Paladin. I personally like to take the dueling fighting style of my Paladin and use him with his shield and sort of make him the tank that gives him extra damage when he's, using a one-handed weapon, which is nice. You're going to get the bulk of your damage on your Paladin from the Divine Smite class feature, so, using a two-handed is not really necessary, and I like to take, like, the tank role, if you will, as a Paladin, kind of soak up damage and deal a lot of damage on the front line using Divine Smite. And a couple things about Divine Smite. Remember that if you miss with Divine Smite, you don't consume a spell slot. So sometimes, like, if you have a 50% chance to hit, it's still worth using Divine Smite, because even if you miss, you just miss the attack, and if you connect, then maybe you killed the target. And it's not, something you have to take into consideration when gambling with your attack. And the other thing is that you can use Divine Smite from any spell slots you have. So if you multi-class with a full spellcaster, maybe like a Bard or a Sorcerer, you'll have more spell slots that you can use for spells, but also that you could use for Divine Smite. So if you're going to multi-class, maybe consider one of those two classes. You can also multi-class with Warlock very well, but they do not have as many spell slots, so you won't get as many uses of Divine Smite from it, although they will be stronger Divine Smites. One benefit of the Warlock, though, is that you can gain your spell slots back on short rest, so you can pick up the Divine Smites very easily on short rest. And when it comes to selecting your subclass, I think they all kind of play very similarly, in my opinion, from what I've seen so far. That is to say, you're mostly a good character. I think Oath of Vengeance gives you a little more freedom to kind of be a dick now and then, but, you're still not going to just be able to turn around and murder one of your companions or an NPC, and everyone's like, that's fine. So, if you're like playing a paladin and you're worried about the restrictions of the decisions you have to make as a paladin, because if you don't follow your paladin oath, then, you're going to be an oath breaker. Not everyone wants to do that. I would suggest going with Oath of Vengeance because it gives you a little bit more freedom to play around with, doing horrible things, but not quite in the evil realm of things. And if you're just talking about subclasses in general, I really like Oath of the Ancients and Oath of Vengeance the most. Oath of the Ancients gives you Moonbeam at level 5. I really like this spell. I mentioned this before on Druid, but you can cast it, and then you can use another action to keep moving it around without consuming more spell slots, and that's really, really handy when you don't have a lot of spell slots. Additionally, you gain Misty Step, and that allows you to teleport, so you can teleport to an enemy and get in range. Paladins don't have the mobility that monks and barbarians do, so being able to teleport to where you need to go to position yourself, especially if you're playing a tanky paladin, super valuable. Also gain Misty Step at level 5, which is really nice, but you also gain Hold Person. I don't know if you know this, but if you trap something or a character with Hold Person and you attack them in melee range, you do automatic critical hits. So if you cast Hold Person and then your other characters attack them in melee, they're going to get messed up, or if they're still being held on your turn again, you get 2 attacks at guaranteed crit, which is really, really nice. Also, they can use Hunter's Mark to increase their damage as a bonus action, and this is great because Hunter's Mark, if you kill the target, then can be cast again without using another spell slot until you rest, so you could use this a lot without using a lot of spell slots, and you absolutely should if you're playing Oath of Vengeance. So Paladins gain their extra attack at level 5, but something else to consider is that they also gain Aura of Protection at level 6, which gives them their Charisma modifier to all of their saving throws. That's huge, and this is an aura around them, right? So this also affects characters around them. That is a lot of extra protection against negative effects and spells. If you are playing a Paladin, you might want to wait until after level 6 to multi-class because that is a really, really strong class feature. And that takes us to Ranger. For Ranger, I like to choose 2-weapon fighting or archery for my weapon style, like my fighting style. I think Rangers make very good archers, and they also can use 2 weapons very effectively. They typically can play Dexterity. They can also play Strength if they want, but Dexterity gives them the flexibility to use 2 weapons and archery very, very effectively. As far as your favorite enemy goes, I would just choose the one that you like the proficiency in the most. The other bonuses are not super important unless you really want to wear heavy armor, then Ranger Knight is a good choice. I mean, you could always give yourself that flexibility, particularly if you're planning on playing a melee Ranger. But for Natural Explorer, I would take the fire resistance first because there are a lot of fire consumables and explosions in the game from early game enemies, and that can protect you from damage a lot. And for subclass, I highly recommend either Beastmaster or Gloomstalker. These are both really, really strong subclasses. Beastmaster is going to allow you to summon an animal companion. These different animal companions have different abilities, and that's like an extra body on the battlefield that can soak up damage from the enemy, that can deal damage on a turn. That basically gives you 5 characters while your beast is out, and that's really, really strong. Additionally, Gloomstalker, on the other hand, makes it so that on your first turn in combat, not only can you move further, but you can deal an extra attack, and it will deal more damage, and this is not part of your attack action. So you're actually going to gain extra attacks on Ranger. And then at level 5, when you actually gain the extra attack feature, you'll be able to do that first attack on your first turn for free, doing extra damage. Then you can take your regular attack, and then you get your extra attack. So you'll actually have 3 attacks per turn at level 5 with the Gloomstalker, which is pretty strong in my opinion. And just like other martial classes that gain extra attack at level 5, it's tough to want to multi-class out of these classes at this level or before this level, because if you're level 4 and 1 more level is going to give you an extra attack every turn, it's hard to justify whatever you gain on top of that, because having an extra attack is huge. That's a huge power increase for your character. So if you're going to multi-class Ranger also, at least if you're a beginner player, I highly recommend that you wait till after level 5. Okay, then moving to Rogue, let's talk about Sneak Attack. There are really 2 ways you can gain Sneak Attack on your Rogue. First is by having advantage on your attacks. There's a lot of ways to have advantage on your attacks. Probably the easiest one, though, is going into hiding. And at level 2, you actually gain Cunning Action Hide on rogues. So you can actually hide with your bonus action at the beginning of your turn if you're not already hidden, and then attack with Sneak Attack, and you can gain this most of the time. Now, you might need to move first and get out of line of sight to do this. Sometimes you can just do it where you are. And keep in mind that if you go into hiding and then you need to move to shoot a target, you move a lot slower, so you're not going to cover as much distance. But doing hide with your bonus action and then doing Sneak Attack with your main action with like a bow or a melee attack, usually this is a lot easier to do with a bow. So if you're playing a new player, strongly recommend kind of favoring the bow on your rogue early on until you get the ropes, and using the bonus action hide. Keep in mind that is a hide as a regular action, and then there's Cunning Action Hide, so make sure you use the right one, and then try and use Sneak Attack. The other way is if you shoot a target that's next to a friendly unit, and that's a lot easier to do, but you don't have advantage on that attack, so you're less likely to connect when you're with your attack roll. So I try and get advantage every time I can. That means when I'm playing my rogue, I'm usually trying to hide anyway, even if the character is standing next to my target, just so I can have a higher chance of connecting. And when it comes to subclass, I highly recommend Assassin to new players, and that's because what it does is it's going to give you advantage against any target who has not taken a turn yet in combat. So this is going to be the first round. You're going to have advantage, which is going to make you more likely to connect and meets the criteria for sneak attacks. Whether you're hiding, not hiding, whether your friendly unit is near the target or not, you're automatically going to have advantage against any enemy that hasn't taken a turn. And that's going to help you easily trigger your sneak attack without going through hiding or having to wait for a teammate to get there or anything like that. It's going to make it easier for you to play a rogue if you're a new player. One other tip is I try and take down one target with sneak attack at the beginning of combat. Like, I find the squishiest target and just try and wipe it out because it's a really high burst damage, and it's a good way to do that, and it makes it so your party's going to take less damage. And also, if you're talking about multi-classing a rogue, they don't have an extra attack at level 5, so their damage is really going to come from sneak attack, which increases at every odd rogue level. And which means that they can multi-class at any point. It's just that what's the best point for you? You know, it's probably going to be after level 3 at least, so that they can take their subclass. And, you know, how much sneak attack do you want to lose by multi-classing? That's the decision you need to make. That's up to anyone, but they don't necessarily have to go to level 5 like some of these other martial classes, where it kind of makes more sense to multi-class after that. You could do it a bit earlier on a rogue if you want. Okay, moving on to Sorcerer. The first thing you're going to have to decide on Sorcerer is what subclass to choose. I personally like Draconic Bloodline the best. It not only gives you more armor class while you're unarmored, but it's also going to increase the damage you deal with the element that you choose. And Firebolt is kind of like a staple cantrip for a lot of casters, and if you pick fire, you're going to add your charisma modifier to the damage of that roll. That's just going to help it out a lot. At that point, though, the Firebolt cantrip will deal about double the damage it normally does, so it's less important at that point. But I do really like that one, or Storm Sorcery if you plan on playing a Lightning Mage. If you're playing a new player, Wild Magic is a bit rough because you channel or you create random effects when you use your magic, and they could be good or bad, and I'm not sure a new player having these random effects is going to help them as much as they think it will. And another tip I would give early game sorcerers is use your sorcery points to create extra spell slots if you need them. This is a great way to gain extra spells, and sorcerers can get a lot of spells because of this. So early on in the game, you know, by all means, rest whenever you need to rest and don't wait on resting, as I mentioned before. But like if you're in the middle of a fight and you need spells, use your sorcery points, give yourself some spells, cast those spells so you're not just standing there doing nothing. In terms of spells, I really like Cloud of Daggers. It's a really strong control AoE spell. It's good to have basically on any class that has it. Magic Missile's also great to help you connect to, you know, hard to hit targets, or when you really just need to take something out, or maybe you need to split your damage up between multiple targets. It's a really, really useful spell. So both of those are really good early game spells. You will also be able to select Enhance Ability on your Sorcerer. If you don't have Enhance Ability on a class, like if you didn't bring a class that can use Enhance Ability, these are Bard, Druid, or Cleric, take it on your Sorcerer. It's super, super useful as well. And another tip is, like, if you want to gain some armor on your Sorcerer, an easy way to do it is by selecting a race that gives you armor proficiencies like Githyanki. And that just gives you easy armor. So maybe you don't want to have to worry about dexterity for armor class. You can get rid of it, and you can pump constitution and charisma and maybe get a little extra wisdom or intelligence for skill checks, etc. So if you want to get some armor and like increase your armor class, maybe you don't care about, you know, the Draconic Bloodline you're playing, different subclass, whatever. That's a great way to gain extra armor class as well. Okay, moving on to Warlock. Warlock, I recommend taking the Fiend if you're a new player for a couple reasons. First, it gains a lot of offensive spells, like fire spells, that are really fun to use in combat and deal a lot of damage. Additionally, it gives a class feature that gives you like an extra health bubble when you kill enemies, which can help keep you alive, which is really good when you're first learning the game. You're definitely going to want to take Hex early on as one of your spells, and Hex is great because you throw it on an enemy, and then when you deal damage to them, you get extra damage, and it's a bonus action, so you can throw Hex, attack with your Eldritch Blast or a weapon attack, whichever you're using, although I do recommend Eldritch Blast for new players. And then if you kill the target, then you can recast Hex without using another spell slot. So you can kind of keep reusing this spell without consuming another spell slot, so you'll use one to cast it initially, but then you can just kind of keep recasting it. And that's just going to boost your damage over the course of a fight, or like a longer fight. It's really, really strong. For Eldritch Invocations early on, I recommend getting Agonizing Blast to increase your damage and Repelling Blast to knock enemies backwards when you hit them with Eldritch Blast. This is great because you can knock enemies to their death a lot of times, or you can propel them away from you where you're safe. And both of these are just really strong early on. Eventually, depending on what race you picked, Devil's Sight is also very, very good to give you superior dark vision. This is going to make it easier to hit enemies with Eldritch Blast in the Underdark, and in other dark areas of the game. So it's definitely worth picking up if you didn't select a race that has dark vision or superior dark vision. And again, I know I've suggested this a few times here, but Cloud of Daggers, really strong spell, good for area denial and damage over time. Make sure you pick this one up if you can. And I know there are a lot of players out there that are looking to use Pact of the Blade because they gain an extra attack at level 5 when they have Pact of the Blade with their Pact weapon. And I don't recommend that for new players. I think it's harder to play a Warlock unless you really know what you're doing with a Pact weapon. Obviously, if you're familiar with 5e and you've done this before on tabletop, then you're going to be very familiar with how to do this in this game. And I'm not speaking to you, but just brand new Warlock players, Eldritch Blast is really, really strong. And I think you should probably lean into that rather than trying to do, like, you know, attacks with melee weapons or something like that. If you pick Pact of the Tome instead, you'll actually gain Guidance, which is great, especially if you don't have a support class that has Guidance, as I've talked about Guidance a lot in this video. And you'll gain Vicious Mockery, so you and Bards can use Vicious Mockery, and that's just a really fun spell. It also gives targets disadvantage on their next attack roll, which is really strong against, you know, enemies that are really hard hitting. Okay, and then we come to Wizard, and a couple really good spells early on for Wizard are Magic Missile. That's a good one to pick up. Definitely recommend taking that. Grease is not bad. It's a good early area control spell that you can drop for people to walk into that, you know, they'll either slip and fall, go prone, or it'll knock them prone when you land on them. It's good early for area denial, and again, Cloud of Daggers is also a really good spell, and as you get higher level, Fireball is a great one to pick up. If you're talking about subclass for Wizard, I really like Evocation for new players because essentially what it does is just protects your friendlies from AoE spells that you use. Like if you throw a fireball into your fighter and 3 dudes, then your fighter takes no damage. And that's great because, you know, you can put your tank out front, enemies will group up around them, and then you can fling your fireball and you don't have to worry about nuking your tank. It's really easy to use for a new player, and it makes things a bit easier in terms of positioning. And another really solid choice here is Divination. What this is going to do initially is when you long rest, you're going to gain 2 random dice that you can use to either change an attack roll or a saving throw. And these are going to be random from 1 to 20 every time you rest. And what you're going to want to do is like give an enemy attacker, a low number so they miss, or a friendly unit a high number so they hit, or friendly number a saving throw so they succeed at their saving throw that's high. And that's the general strategy with it. And again, because you rest so much in this game, I think you're going to be able to use both of these like in a combat or in 2 combats, and then you're going to rest anyway and get them back. So I think it's really, really strong. And just like Sorcerer, you know, don't be afraid to get armor on your Wizard. Like if you want to take a race during character creation or multi-class with like a fighter for 1 level or something in order to pick up some armor proficiency, it's not a bad idea to give you more protection. And unlike Sorcerer, Wizards don't have a school of magic that's going to give them extra armor like the Draconic Bloodline will. So it's really a lot better even on a Wizard than a Sorcerer in most cases. So consider doing that in order to give yourself a little more protection. So that wraps up our beginner class tips. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some ideas on how to play these classes effectively, since I know a lot of you are going to be playing them over the next few weeks. And, you know, maybe you just need like, oh, I can't really figure out what to do with this class. I really want to play it. Or maybe you just want to play it a little bit better. Hopefully these tips helped you. Stay tuned. We have more guides coming. We have more mechanics guides coming. We have more class guides coming, beginner class levels and advanced class level guides, including multi-class. And we have a multi-classing guide coming. So if you want more guide content, stay tuned. It's just around the corner. And I want to know what you guys think about the video. Are there things that I missed? Are there tips I should have given people that you would give them? Let me know in the comments below so that players can benefit from those tips.